We had, that is homeopathy generally, had this attack through the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Commons, organised by a Member of Parliament who was subsequently defeated, possibly because of his attack.
That particular inquiry resulted in a recommendation to the government, to the NHS, that homeopathy, because there is no science to it, should be withdrawn from the NHS. Fortunately, the new coalition government, when they issued their response, they dismissed the report. So officially, homeopathy should be available on the NHS.
I was speaking at the Glastonbury conference, and I think Jeff, you had a transformative moment at Glastonbury. You did. Well, I did too, and I think it's the energy of being with 250,000 people. It does something for you. And I decided then that I was going to broaden the attack generally and started talking about the Indian system of medicine, which is Ayush.
Our Prime Minister, the most dynamic Prime Minister we have seen is Mr. Narendra Modi. He is in favor of homeopathy and he is openly promoting homeopathy throughout the country. He says homeopathy must become the first line of treatment among masses, because it is not only cheap, but it has no side effects. And then it treats the patient from the root permanently.
In addition to our proving research, we also believe that basic science research is critical to move the field of homeopathy forward, because one of the largest attacks on homeopathy is not clinically based, but it's based on homeopathy being what some people refer to as the medicine of the impossible science or the impossible pharmacy or whatever, that there's nothing in it.
Research which is going around in homeopathy within India and even internationally, like a lot of people working on the memory of water, that where the water can really preserve the memory, and they see the changes from one source from one potency to the second. And there's been Indian Institute of Technology in India who've done a research on certain atoms and really minerals and atoms, whereby they could really see the source of the content as high as on a 200 potency. So that could be really identified, but yeah, they're getting closer by the day.
Interesting study that was done here in the United States through the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at alternative medicine usage here in the United States. And it revealed that over 50% of patients use alternative medicine here in the United States, and 90% never tell their medical provider that they use alternative medicine.
The biggest challenge in homeopathy today is the funding. The research needs the financial support which can really help the industry to really go to the root to find the research aspects.
It actually gets harder and harder to get funded to do clinical trial research in the field right now, because the primary objection to homeopathy is usually focused around the nature of the remedies, the medicines that are used by practitioners. Many of the skeptics really haven't looked at all at the clinical practice theory to see whether there was value in that. And there's all sorts of interesting emerging evidence I haven't been involved with, but there's all sorts suggesting that some of the other aspects of homeopathic practice, other than the remedies, actually can be scientifically studied and validated.
In one or two trials that I've done with homeopathy delivered in a relevant clinical context, the observation that I have had is that the homeopathic consultation is an incredibly powerful agent. Even if the conventional doctor is a very good conventional doctor, and in many of our trials that was the case, the actual intervention of the homeopath, because of the way they consult and the individualized way they approach people, is in fact hugely powerful. And it's that particular aspect that homeopathy appears to deliver. And conventional medicine has great difficulty getting its head round.
But my interest then gravitated to, well, what is it about this issue? And so I reviewed the literature in on the what would be called the basic science of homeopathic remedies. These include things showing electromagnetic signals that can be uniquely measured from homeopathically prepared materials. And they included studies showing optical effects, where there appears to be a kind of unique luminescent property of a remedy when it's under certain kinds of laboratory testing.
Yeah, I knew from the start that I wanted to investigate potencies above 12C, so well beyond Avogadro's number. Because if you work with potencies below 12C, there's always a possibility that you're picking up sort of effects of material doses. So I was looking for some sort of chemical system that would detect potencies above 12C. And the program that I'm involved in is using a special kind of dye called a solvatochromic dye that changes its colour depending upon the environment that it's in. And it so happens that if you introduce potencies, that there's a very slight change in the nature of the dye, which can be picked up with special instrumentation. And so that's really the work that I've been doing the last 5 years. And there's no doubt that with high potencies, and now I'm using potencies at the 50M level, that we're picking up a signal from the potencies that can be detected by the dyes, which is, you know, very exciting, really.
We have been involved through our research department in doing some basic science research that in particular looks at nanomedicine, nanoparticles, and their presence or absence in homeopathic solutions. And you know, the research is somewhat primitive to date. It's being conducted now, but early indications show that indeed all remedy preparations, even well beyond Avogadro's number, contain nanoparticles. And not only do they contain nanoparticles, but those nanoparticles are quite different at different potencies. So if you look at the nanoparticles in a 30C potency and you compare those to the nanoparticles in a 200C potency, they look very different because of the succussion and dilution process.
When you are succussing something in a container, frequently and classically with Hahnemann, that was glass. That was actually not plastic or some other synthetic material. It turns out that you are actually knocking silica off the glassware walls into the solution.
I think this is really exciting, and we need to do more research along these lines, but this really will allow us to go back to these skeptics and say, well, we have definitive evidence now that it's not just placebo, but there are actually something there, something that can be studied and looked at. Now, getting from those nanoparticles to a mechanism of how they treat disease is a whole nother question, and an interesting one that needs to be looked at.
So all of a sudden, you not only have whatever the source material was and its nanoparticles being transferred, but now you have silica. Well, what's interesting about silica? It's a semiconductor material. As nanoparticles, silica is very powerful in stimulating the immune system. In fact, it can serve as an adjunctive material. It actually amplifies the effects of ordinary vaccines. It's a carrier. It actually is a fascinating material unto itself. So if you were to bang the parts of what would be called silicates off the glassware wall, those can actually form themselves. They self-assemble. And if you happen to have something in the solution to assemble around, it turns out that silica can do that quite nicely. So you can actually make what might be called a body cast of anything that's in solution. And when silica coats something, it actually stabilizes those particles frequently. It amplifies their effects. This kind of technology is used in things from solar cells to some nanomedicines. Silica is a well-tolerated nanomaterial in the body. And this whole thing about agitation producing the silica has even been independently reported in the pharmacy literature for conventional drugs.
The nanoparticle issue also can help us answer not only the skeptics' questions, but it can also help us with answering questions that have plagued us for a century or more in homeopathy in terms of homeopathic practice. And that is, because we have nanoparticles as a mechanism of action, we can begin to definitively answer questions about antidoting remedies. What kind of substances antidote nanoparticles and inactivate them from being effective? Sunlight. We can look at temperature issues. We can look at, start studying things like coffee and does that antidote, and these kinds of questions that there have been on debates in the homeopathic community for some time. I think we can much more effectively address now that we begin to have mechanisms of action. Also, we haven't really gotten to this level yet, but there are very interesting questions that are beginning to be generated in terms of manufacturing of remedies. Because if nanoparticles is how we are generating substances in homeopathy, then you can look at nanoparticle generation from various manufacturers and see very different results. And the question is, which are the results that are we most looking for, and what processes in manufacturing remedies are the most effective ones at generating the kinds of nanoparticles that we're looking for. So there are all sorts of interesting spin-offs that are coming out of this basic science research that is very exciting right now.
And what I want to see is a complete change where we no longer rely just on so-called evidence-based medicine, but we look at the long tradition of usage. We look at patients' experience. We cannot deny this. It's completely absurd to be in a situation where we don't take note of how patients feel about themselves. And also, it's maddening that good inquiries are ignored. We were in Cuba recently, and where one of the greatest homeopathic studies of all time was conducted in 3 provinces of Cuba. Why is it that the conventional community will persistently ignore these studies? And I'm very pleased to hear today that in India, there are studies going on now where doctors themselves are prescribing to some patients placebo and to some patients homeopathic medicine without knowing which is which. And there's this very great study, the results will be seen in the near future. Now, where are we going in the future? Well, homeopathy has to be at the heart of the health service. I would like to see a much more aggressive approach from the homeopathic community. I think you need to get into your new MP's surgeries. The one thing that all of you can do is go and see your MP, go and tell them. And the message you need to get across is that we are not competing with allopathic medicine. To use the coalition buzzword, we are all in it together. You can take the pressure off doctors. Let hard-pressed doctors get on with things that they best treat. You can deal with patients that sometimes are very difficult to treat. So we can work side by side, as they do in India,